down a little bit. We're lucky today to have John Carlin, who is an old friend and I think one of the more dynamic officials working in the cyberspace. We're going to talk largely today about three things: espionage, cyber-espionage, and espionage. But so I think the way we've done this is, are we having a question? Alvaro, are we giving people cards to? Good. So write your questions down and pass them up. We'll get to them. We'll probably talk about a couple other things as well, but that's the main theme. And we'll start with a few remarks and then go directly into Q&A.
Sounds good.
Great.
Thank you, Jim.
Thanks.
Well, thanks for being here today and having me. What I'd do is give a little overview of what the National Security Division is and what our approach has been when it comes to the cyber threat. The National Security Division is the first new litigating division at the Department of Justice in about 50 years. And we were created with one simple mission in mind, which was that the attacks of September 11th had occurred in part because we had failed to effectively share information across the law enforcement and intelligence divide. And that was a mistake that we could never make again. In order to change the behavior inside government to share that information, we changed the law to allow sharing across the law enforcement and intelligence divide, but we also had certain structural changes, one of which was the creation of the National Security Division. And the idea was that the lawyers who prosecute terrorist cases, the lawyers who do intelligence, the lawyers who do the review of certain transactions to ensure there's no national security risk, those that give advice to the intelligence community, that they should all sit under one roof and that they should work together day in, day out, and that success would no longer be measured by the successful prosecution of a terrorist after the attack has occurred, when families are grieving and they've lost loved ones. Success was going to be preventing the attack from occurring in the first place. And in order to do that, you had to be intelligence-led. In other words, as lawyers, you need to have access to the full range of intelligence to see what the community thought the threat was, and then threat-driven. Once you figure out who is the terrorist, who is the terrorist group, what can we do to disrupt that group? It may be the use of the criminal justice system, but it might very well be a sanction that prevents them from getting the funding that they need. It might be using the Commerce Department's authorities to designate them as an entity where you can't export goods to prevent them from getting weapons of mass destruction. It might be the State Department diplomacy, and it might be military action. That we should be agnostic as to what the tool is, but do whatever the full range of activity that you can do under the law to prevent the terrorists from accomplishing their aims of committing a terrorist attack. And we certainly know now that we're in an extraordinarily complicated and difficult environment when it comes to terrorist threats. Last year, we brought more cases involving terrorists inside the United States, international terrorists inside the United States, than we ever have before, around 60 cases. And since the Islamic State in the Levant adopted a new strategy of crowdsourcing terrorism, using social media to call upon people not just to join them as foreign terrorist fighters, but calling on them to commit attacks where they live, we've seen all across the world a small number, but it doesn't take a very large number to cause devastating tragedies to families, answer that call and commit attacks where they live. And preventing terrorism will continue to be the top priority of the National Security Division. But we're here today to talk about cyber. What I realized when I was over as a prosecutor prosecuting criminal hacking cases, computer hacking cases, I used to work with a great squad at the FBI that did the criminal side of the house. But there was another squad, and they were behind literally a locked door. They were working on the intelligence side of the house. The whole time I was working criminal computer hacking cases, I never went on the other side of that door. And occasionally, one of the agents I was working with would switch squads and go to that squad, and they were just gone. You didn't see them again. When I went over to the FBI to work as Chief of Staff to Director Mueller, and we were working on transforming how the FBI integrated with the rest of the community to see what the intelligence was showing on the cyber threat, I got to see what was on the other side of that previously locked door. And what they did was an amazing job of figuring out what was occurring with the threat. There was a giant jumbotron screen, much larger than the wall behind me, And you could see in real time nation-state actors, day in, day out, intruding into US companies. They'd hop into, say, a university, then they go over to a private company, and then you would literally watch on this giant screen in real time as data exfiltrated out of the country, as we lost billions of dollars of intellectual property. Real theft with real harm to real victims. And it became clear that this was an amazing feat of intelligence, but what we were seeing was horrifying, and watching it on the screen wasn't sufficient. We needed to apply some of the same lessons that we'd applied to terrorists post 9/11 when it came to cyber threat actors. And that meant making sure that we looked at that intelligence and looked to see, are there legal ways that we can do disruptions? Are there ways that we can deter? And I'll give you a little sense of where we are now. There's one case in particular. So imagine you're a company today, and you see inside your system what looks like a relatively low-level, unsophisticated hack. And the hacker steals a relatively small amount of personally identifiable information. You watch it leave your system, like so many companies are seeing day in, day out. Then when you kick that hacker off your system or think they're off your system, you get a threat through a commercial email service, say it's Gmail, that says, give me $500 through Bitcoin, or I'm going to embarrass you by releasing this information. Low dollar amount, unsophisticated way of doing extortion. Most companies today pay the $500 and go back to business. What they don't realize is the blended threat. They don't realize what they don't know unless they partner with government. In this case, and this is a real case, the company did partner with the government. And what they found out was, although it would look like a relatively unsophisticated hacker doing this for criminal profit, it actually was what I'll call a blended threat. On the back end, you had an individual named Farizi, a Kosovo extremist who had moved to Malaysia, in part to get better access to bandwidth. In a conspiracy, he was hacking into the company. And then what he was doing with the stolen personally identifiable information was he wasn't doing it for money. He was passing it to one of the most notorious cyber terrorists in the world at the time, a British citizen named Junaid Hussain, who was living at the time in Raqqa, Syria, located at the heart of the Islamic State in the Levant. And what he was doing with the information was culling through it to find out the names and addresses of government employees, and then blasting that information back through Twitter with a specific call to kill those people where they lived. No company, if they had known that, would choose to handle that on their own. Both as citizens, they wouldn't want to be responsible for the death of a fellow citizen, and also just as a pure business decision, it would be game over for that brand if they were responsible for a terrorist attack. The problem with this threat, and why tackling cyber is like in some ways what we had to do to transform to meet terrorism, insofar as we need to start sharing information across the law enforcement intelligence divide, but it's one step more complicated, because in addition to sharing with law enforcement and intelligence, we also need to figure out a way to get the private sector, where so much of the infrastructure resides, to share information with government, and in government we need to do a better job of sharing back what we're seeing with private companies. We've started that new approach when it comes to national security cyber threats. Starting at the end of 2012, we cross-trained national security cyber specialists in every U.S. attorney's office across the country. So on the one hand, they learned about the bits, the bytes, and the peculiarities of cyber law, Electronic Communications Privacy Act, the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act. But on the other hand, that they were read in at the highest level of clearance, knew how to handle sensitive information, and saw what the threat is. They were sent back out to the field. At the same time, the FBI issued an edict that said, thou shalt share what had formerly only been on the intelligence side with this new specially trained cadre, just the way we've done for years in terrorism cases. That change in approach led to the first case of its kind, which was the indictment of 5 members of the People's Liberation Army, Unit 61398, for their activity in attacking the full range of American industry, from nuclear to solar to steel, from management side and labor side. They were good at bringing everyone together. And what they were stealing was not traditional intelligence information, but instead they would steal things like there'd be a company about to do a joint venture with its Chinese partner. Right before that company was going to pay them to lease a lead pipe, they went in and stole the designs for the lead pipe. Or to use another example, a solar company, they went into the systems, they sold the pricing information for the solar company's goods so they could place their goods right below that of the solar company and do what's called price dumping, which is try to force them out of the market by artificially pricing their products below the solar companies. And then, to add insult to injury, when that company tried to sue, to bring litigation, they stole the litigation strategy too. So some have asked, why do we bring this case? And the answer is simple. This is theft. Once we were working it together, we were able to do what some had said could not be done, which is, with hard work by great investigators, to do the investigation attribution to figure out by name, by face, with sufficient level of proof that we thought we could prove it beyond a reasonable doubt, who did it. So investigation attribution. Secondly, once you figure out who did it, don't treat it just as an intelligence problem, because it's not. It's theft. Make it public. And third, have a consequence. In this case, the consequence was the bringing of a criminal indictment. Look, there's a concept that many of you are familiar with that says in U.S. law, if you let someone walk across your lawn long enough, they have what's called an easement. They gain the right under law to walk across your lawn. The international law is customary law. It works along the same principle. And if we continue to let China noisily steal intellectual property, business strategies, we'd be saying that it's okay. And so you can think in some respects of this case and this approach as being a giant no trespassing sign, get off our lawn. It to send the signal that this is criminal activity like other criminal activity. So fast forward a little bit to the Sony intrusion. You have the attack on Sony by North Korean entities, and what you see there is a destructive attack designed to change behavior. And you saw at that point, we had already done the PLA case, the National Security Council respond as a national security event. And the approach that we applied is quite similar. Now that's an instructive case insofar as Sony did exactly the right thing. They cooperated immediately with the FBI, with Department of Homeland Security, so we could do the investigation, attribution, and figure out who did it. Then you saw in 28 days, we figured out who did it, that it was North Koreans, and we said it publicly that it was North Korea. And that was a change that hadn't been done before. And third, in that case, they were able to sanction the North Koreans, and that's partly because there was already an existing mechanism in place to sanction them. But we realized if it had been another country, there was no such mechanism. That's why you saw the president sign in to effect a new executive order April 1st of last year that allows for the sanctioning of actors purely because it's cyber activity. We've had that tool when it came to terrorists, when it came to those who proliferate weapons of mass destruction, but we hadn't had it in cyber. And significantly, that executive order also allows not just to sanction those who commit the hack, but if you're able to prove it, to sanction those who are the beneficiaries of the stolen trade secret or the stolen intellectual property or the stolen business negotiation strategy. So you can go after those who gain. I believe it is that combination of showing that we could do the investigation attribution, that we're willing to make it publicly and endure costs potentially to a relationship, that led to the first, a significant event in that President Xi of China sent over a high-level delegation right before President Xi and President Obama were to meet and negotiated the so-called 5-point agreement. Significant among those 5 points was that President Xi stood with President Obama, and together they said, the world we live in is a world in which, as a norm, we do not think it is right to use your intelligence services, your government actors, to steal information from private companies for private economic gain. And because they were able to broker that agreement, that led to the G20 adopting that same norm shortly thereafter. And if we're going to live, in some respects, the president used this phrase, cyber's like the Wild West. I think many would agree. If we want to move to a world where that is not the acceptable status quo, but we want to have a sheriff in town, first step is coming up with norms. So there's a law of the land over what's acceptable. Now, we'd be out of business as prosecutors and law enforcement if having laws on the books was sufficient to end all behavior. So I think the next step will be then enforcing what the norms are that people live. And you saw, I'll end with, before we move into the discussion, with a good week when it came to applying this approach, at least using the criminal justice system as one of, but it shouldn't be the only tool. You saw on a Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, about a month and a half ago. On Tuesday, we announced charges against members of the Syrian Electronic Army. And this was for their alleged activities. And I say alleged because one of the individuals has been arrested, extradited, and is facing charges here in the United States and will have a right and should have a right to defend himself in the court of law. But what they alleged to have done is they hacked a site, defaced it, and said that the White House was under attack and that the White House had been destroyed, which caused the stock market to plunge and lose billions of dollars worth of value, along with other activity. According to the allegations we laid out in the complaint, however, just like Farizi, this is an example of a blended threat because they didn't just do activity on behalf of the Syrian Electronic Army. They also were extorting companies across the world, and they were extorting the companies, threatening cyber attacks just in order to make a buck, just in order to line their own pockets with profits. Some of those companies paid, and they paid in part because they didn't know they were paying off the Syrian Electronic Army. So we announced those charges. The Germans arrested one of those individuals, and as I mentioned, has been extradited to the United States and will face trials. That's Tuesday. Wednesday, individual named Su Bin pleads guilty in the Central District of California. Su Bin had been a Chinese businessman located in Canada in a conspiracy with two others located in China to hack into Boeing along with other companies and steal commercial secrets for profit. He was arrested pursuant to our process by the Canadians, and then after 2 years of fighting extradition, waived, pled guilty in the Central District of California. So those are real charges, real defendant serving real prison time, and the sentencing will be coming up. That was Wednesday. And then Thursday, we announced charges against Iranian affiliated actors responsible for the denial of service attacks against our entire financial sector, over 46 different financial institutions, affecting tens of thousands of customers, costing hundreds of millions of dollars. And we outlined that one of those individuals also hacked into the Bowman Dam in Rye, New York, accessing the sluice control systems, which would have allowed him to open the dam and cause flooding. Now, unbeknownst to him, the dam was not working at the time. It was down for maintenance. But I think we can all agree that crumbling infrastructure is not our best line of defense against cyber actors. So that was Thursday. And I think it shows together that we can do, when we work with the private sector, share information across the intelligence law enforcement divide, we can figure out exactly who did it. And no theory of deterrence is going to work unless the adversary knows that we can figure out who did it. It's not anonymous, it's not free. Second, that we're willing in select cases to be public about it and impose a cost and impose churn. And three, that in addition to being public about it, we are also willing to take actions that impose a consequence, be it criminal charges, be it sanctions. In the case of Su Bin, the company that he was affiliated with got designated by the Commerce Department as an entity to whom you can't trade without a license from the United States. And it's the first, I believe, use of that authority in a pure cyber-related case. So that's, we recently put out an article in the Harvard National Security Review that I know we'll talk about today. But what we're trying to do is, a lot of these cases get analyzed as one-offs. So what does the PLA case mean in terms of our China relationship? Or what does the Iran case mean in terms of Iranian relationships? But to put it instead in a different context, which is, this isn't about one particular bilateral relationship. This is about trying to build the world that we want to live in when it comes to cyber threats. And part of that world is going to mean being able to detect, disrupt cyber threats, and therefore deter would-be cyber actors. Thank you, and then I look forward to taking questions.
Great, thank you, John. You know, I was so eager to get started. They gave me this long bio and I didn't read it, so I'm going to just hit some highlights here. Some of which you heard from John, the Sony Entertainment hack, which was a big one, the indictment of the PLA. The first case, the first conviction under the Economic Espionage Act, it's been around a long time. It's kind of surprising. More importantly, Chief of Staff to FBI Director Mueller, and perhaps most fun for those of us in the district, he was AUSA for the District of Columbia in the criminal part and did a lot. So NSD is coming up on its 10th anniversary. When is it?
It's this September, and we're going to have an event here at CSIS.
Oh, we are? Oh, okay. Well, good to know. Thank you. When you look back at NSD, what would you do differently? Would you change anything? What would you want to do different with NSD?
I think the National Security Division is one of the great successes in terms of post 9/11 reforms. It didn't require a huge expenditure, and looking back on it, it seems like common sense, although there was some debate or controversy at the time. But this idea of having the lawyers who do the intelligence work before the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court, who work on guidelines issues, sit together with the prosecutors, those that do policy issues, those that do things like the Committee on Foreign Investment inside the United States, and therefore be a one-stop shop for the intelligence community, the military, and others in order to make sure that when we're attacking a threat, we really look across the code book. I think then part, though, of what should be in our DNA from that founding is that we have to continue to be agile, and as threats change, we need to change with them. So that might mean responding to the exploitation of social media when it comes to terrorism now, or changing our approach as we have on how to do national security cyber threats. So I don't think the division will ever be static, and we need to continue to move as quickly as the threats do.
If you were going to do sort of a CompStat approach to cyber crime, cyber activity, if you were going to recreate for us that big Jumbotron screen, what are the trends you're seeing now? What's the pattern? I assume it's changed.
You definitely see changes. Look, time will tell, but I think already, even though it's been a relatively short period of time and there haven't been that many enforcement actions, you've seen a change in activity, which really shouldn't be surprising because, I mean, just think about it if you knew you could attempt to hack into any company or any person in the world, and if you got caught, there was absolutely no consequence. Your job's pretty easy. So you don't need to spend a lot of time figuring out how to hide your tracks or avoid getting caught. And that's changed. I think there's an awareness, and people are looking over their shoulder and wondering when they might get picked up, whether it's in Germany or Canada or somewhere else. They're wondering if their government changes its minds on activity. They might get picked up by their own government for activity they thought was okay a couple of years before.
Yeah, I always thought it was sort of a Darwinian test that smart hackers don't take vacations. But on that note, do you see a change in the quality of the people you're going up against? Or have one of the dynamic elements is that it was easy, now there's consequences. Do they get out of the market or do they pick up their game?
Look, there's a lot going on the defensive side of the house, too. And so for the last if you look at over 10 years ago when I was doing these cases to now, the sophistication on both sides of the equation has increased exponentially. And I think you'll continue to see more sophisticated tradecraft. Now, that has a cost, too. And a lot of this was particularly when it comes to the conduct that's done for economic gain. You're trying to influence that cost-benefit analysis so they decide ultimately, gee, it'd be better to invest in research and development instead of trying to steal other people's research and development, a combination of, because it's become so much harder due to the defensive systems, because people maybe, when I say defense, I'm not just talking about building an antivirus wall, because there's no wall you can build that's high enough or deep enough to keep a dedicated adversary out. I'm talking about the full range of activity that might include things like not keeping some of your most sensitive data in digitally in internet-connected systems. So combination of that, plus knowing that when you get caught, that there will be consequences, is starting to influence that equation. At the same time, there are some groups that we know that are out there that are not going to be deterrable, like terrorist groups who've announced publicly that they have the intention to commit devastating cyber attacks if they can. For those groups, we need to continue to work on defense, but also we need to do everything we can to disrupt them from the ability of getting the tools that they want to commit the destructive attacks that right now certain nation states have the capability but not the intent to use.
When you look at the people carrying this out, how many of them are what I would call a proxy for a state, and how many of them are purely organized crime, no connection to the state? Does that line even make sense anymore?
Yeah, so in terms of future threats, that's a good question, and that's where you use the Farizi and the Syrian Electronic Army of what I'll call the blended threat. I think we are seeing the blended threat now, and so that means actors that might act on behalf of a group, but are also doing it for their own profit, for criminal means. They might do hacktivism, and at the same time, they might do some legitimate activity. So Farizi, Syrian Electronic Army are good examples of that. Even the two groups affiliated with the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, the ITSEC team and Mossad, are groups that did other activity as well. So they weren't pure, it wasn't like the members of the People's Liberation Army who, as we laid out in that complaint, that activity started around 9 in the morning Beijing time. It went from 9 to 12. It dipped from 12 to 1, lunch break, and then resumed from 1 to 6, and then reduced again overnight and on weekends. So that was the day job of these uniformed members of the People's Liberation Army. What we're seeing now is less, it may be someone in terms of blended threat where it's a state actor, but it's not state action. So you'll have, be it in Russia or China or other countries, someone who has the access to those tools. Their day job and the use of them is something different. And then for their own personal profit, they use those tools corruptly during nighttime hours to do a hack. So you can figure out who did it, and then doing the disaggregating why they did it is going to be a growing challenge. And for that, you really need to talk to the victim to figure out why would they took what they took when they took it. It's not just the forensic analysis. And that's important both if you want to use it to do disruption, but also just to fill out our general intelligence picture over what's going on.
One of the things that impressed me when you did the PLA indictments was that you prepared the evidence as if you were going to take these people to court. So that was neat, but if I remember correctly, you had one, it took a longer time to actually assemble court-worthy evidence, and two, sometimes it was hard to find companies that wanted to cooperate. Is that still a problem? How does it work in terms of getting evidence?
Yeah, so it's definitely, well, first, one of the reasons I wrote the article is I think a special role that the Department of Justice, FBI, Secret Service, trained law enforcement investigators can do is their whole training and expertise is to gather information in such a way as to be able to use it publicly. And that's just a different skill set and mindset than you'll find in other parts of the intelligence community who are trained to gather information with an eye towards it never being public. So they use different sources and methods to collect it. So having that group work the problem is one reason why you're now seeing us be able to not just know who did it, but be able to use that information publicly and feel confident we could. And we are obligated before we bring a case. There's no difference when it comes to cyber to have the confidence that we could prove it beyond a reasonable doubt, or under our own guidelines, we can't bring a case for symbolic reasons that we wouldn't be able to prove up beyond a reasonable doubt. As it comes to companies, it's gotten a lot better in terms of the cooperation than it was, say, 10 years, but it needs to we're a long way from perfect. And partly it's still, it's on this, Jim, but there's still a mentality of blame the victim when it comes to a hack. And so I think internally companies wrestle with how much damage am I going to do with my shareholders or my stock price if I come forward, because I'm going to have this public humiliation of having been the victim of an attack. And we've tried to change that in part by emphasizing that actually you've had 2 FBI directors now that say either you've been hacked or you've been hacked and you don't know it, because there's nobody immune. And we have certainly proven that's the case with federal government systems as well that are internet connected. So there is no perfect product that you can buy. But as we develop going further, we've got to get better at receiving information from companies and sharing back with them.
This is a complicated question that occurred to me while you were talking. And let me say, too, that you should have cards. If you don't have cards, we have cards available. Write your questions on the card and then hold them up, and we'll find some way to get them up here. I have loads of questions, though. So, oh, my goodness, I unleashed a torrent. This is sort of a question for the webcast audience, and we'll post this on the web, but one of the issues that comes up repeatedly in discussions with some of the governments that you've talked about is they don't understand separation of powers. And so they tend to believe that these are politically directed cases. And maybe you could talk a little bit about that. I know it's a bit awkward, but I've tried to explain separation of powers now several times, and people look like you're insane, you know. The Prime Minister doesn't tell the Justice Department what to do. And it's like, well, no. What do you want to say? And this is large. We have a foreign audience as well in this. Yeah.
And it's something I think some of our counterparts understand that better than others. I've been career at the Department of Justice in different roles, and to the chagrin of multiple administrations. Not really, because I think they understand it. I see Director Webster in the crowd, but the FBI, Department of Justice, when it comes to the hat of deciding whether or not there's sufficient evidence and to bring a criminal case, that's the prerogative of the Attorney General. And in a national security context, we can certainly be informed by the views of others in the community in terms of exercising that discretion, but ultimately it's solely the prerogative of the Attorney General, and we bring cases based on the facts and the evidence, and the relevant law. I don't think that's unique, but there are definitely some counterparts for whom that is not true, and so part of the diplomatic effort, I think, has been to try to explain the way our system works.
I used to hate that, because you'd be involved in something, and then at some point these guys would tell you it was law enforcement sensitive, and they couldn't tell you anything anymore. And I was like, what the heck? A real pain. These are great questions, so I'm just going to go through them. I have more questions, too, so we could maybe keep you here all day. I know you've got a day job. How is the deal with China holding up? Are they keeping their side of the bargain?
So, and I won't be maybe the best expert inside of government. There's actively, I think, folks both within the government and the intelligence community doing assessments to see what the activity looks like. But you're also seeing, and this is another one of these unique to cyberspace areas, you're seeing many of the private vendors who work with a lot of the, who have a lot of companies as clients, and so who see information that we might not otherwise see, do their own assessment. And it seems like generally people have seen a change in activity. There's a debate as to how long lasting it might be, but there has been a change.
Great. You can dodge this one if you want. Why treat the Sands Casino and Sony attacks differently?
I don't know that there's... you need to look at the particular facts that you learn in each investigation and see what you're able to show publicly. So I don't know that there'll be a one-size-fits-all, or that there's a reason if you saw a similar type of act in the future that we might not very well do the investigation attribution if we're able to figure out who did it, find them, and hold them accountable. So for those who would do that style attack, I would not take comfort in the fact that to date we haven't brought a public charge.
Okay. Economic espionage and trade secrets theft. What will it take to use the executive order? What kind of case? These are great questions, by the way. You guys have been prepping.
So I think we're doing, ultimately, unlike the bringing of a criminal prosecution, the use of the order is something that's within ultimately the Secretary of the Treasury, and involves a policy process. In terms of developing the facts and the evidence, though, which is where we've often played a critical role when it comes to using sanctions, I think we've shown we can do the investigation and attribution and brought criminal cases that reveal that people have committed conduct that would violate the terms of the executive order. So that I think the types of facts and circumstances will look a lot like the types of cases you've seen us publicly bring.
We're getting so many questions here. I'm just complaining. We can play cards with these. In the first 6 months after the executive order on cyber sanctions, no sanctions have been imposed. Why not?
Well, I can't give the, I'll say this, long term, I think if we're going to have the world where the norm is enforced, once we start using it, it's got to become a regular part of business. Not all the time, but when you catch actors violating the norm, where we use things like sanctions, where we use the criminal justice system. So I would expect it to occur in the future, that unless, of course, the conduct stops, which would be great. I'm just, in the near term, not confident we're going to see the conduct go down to zero.
We might want to come back to that one because sanctions are a good topic. With the National Security Division blending intel and law enforcement, to what extent is there buy-in from Silicon Valley? They mentioned Facebook, Apple, some others, post-Snowden particularly.
Yeah, so I think when it comes to cybersecurity, look, there were things we had to change in government. At National Security Division, we're used to doing our work in a secure, compartmented environment, and when it came to doing the terrorism threat, we didn't get out there. It wasn't a big part of our job to do outreach to explain why we have the tools that we have, how we use them, what the threats are. This version of the threat, cyber, it requires great engagement with the private sector. And we also, I think, have an obligation. There was a follow-on to the 10-year anniversary of the 9/11 report that said, as government officials, it's our job to explain as best we can what tools we're using, what legal tools we're using, how they work, why we think they're important, so that the public can have an informed debate as to whether or not they're the right tools or reaching the right balance. So we've changed to try to make that more of our mission. For the first, I'm doing more events like these, going out regularly to Silicon Valley, but structurally we changed as well. For the first time, we have a director of outreach, and she works with all the U.S. attorneys' offices across the country to make outreach, even though it's not measurable, like bringing a criminal case, a part of their job. So they go and inform general counsels, universities, here are the threats that we're seeing, and here's the approach that we're taking to them. And so that's a change that we're in the early stages of. And what I found when I go out to Silicon Valley when it comes to cybersecurity, look, these are the great minds that created the systems that are now being exploited by terrorists, crooks, and spies. And they didn't design these products or services to be designed by the bad guys. What I do think happened for a period of time, and this counts for the whole country, is we moved with extraordinary speed when you think about it. So 25 years, according to one study, 98% of what we had was stored in analog space, and now it's the inverse. 97, 98% of what we value, everything, healthcare records to financial records to personal diaries, everything is stored digitally and connected to a medium, the internet, its code is fundamentally not designed to be secure. It was designed for communications. Now, we built that without thinking through what are the risks, what are the downside risks, what are the bad guys going to try to do to take advantage of it. Now we're playing catch-up, which is critically important at this moment in time, in addition to rethinking. And it may be that as part of that thought process, I heard from one person who suffered through a devastating cyber attack and had embarrassing emails published, that they were putting a fax machine back in their office. So rethinking a little bit, do you want everything digitally? But one thing that's critical right now as we move towards the Internet of Things, look, in 2020, 70%, according to one reliable study, of the cars on the road are going to be internet-connected vehicles. They're mobile computers, essentially. Before we go to this next leap, let's make sure, and we have responsibility in government to do that we educate on to how we think the bad guys, the terrorists, the spies, the criminals are going to take advantage of this transition, so that we build in from the front end the security measures and don't put the product out and then try to play catch up.
Maybe on that note, this was a while ago, but some jurisdictions, I beg your pardon, had dollar thresholds for the cases they would take because there were just so many cyber cases they couldn't deal with the flow. How are we doing on that? Do you feel like you're catching up, getting ahead, falling behind? What's the trend?
Yeah, I'll put it in two different buckets. So on the national security side, we don't have a dollar threshold. So if it looks like nation state activity, or certainly terrorist activity, we want the information in. We're going to work it both in order to find who's responsible and disruptive, but also to grow our understanding of what's occurring. That may be different federally on the criminal side of the house, and part of the effort there has to be giving the funding and the time to do the training for state and local enforcement, whether it's state and local police or state attorneys general's offices that have moved into this space so they can be part of the enforcement action, which is really the way our law enforcement system works regularly. Right now there's a plague of ransomware attacks. It's in almost every industry. Ransomware being a hacker gets into the system, often encrypts the data that you most value, and then says, pay me X amount of dollars if you want to see your data again. And another version, slightly a similar version of that, is just pure extortion, where they say, pay me a certain amount of money, or I'm going to do a DDoS attack and take your system down. And part of responding to that means educating people, again, on the defensive side of the house, but it also means as long as people are handling that on their own and making the payments, we're funding the development of more of these tools and more of these actors. So it means working together, as we did against things like the mafia in the early days, or organized crime, to say it's not acceptable. We're all going to come in. We're not going to blame the victim for having gone through a ransomware attack, and then in that way suck the profit motive out of the ransomware attackers.
Maybe just a follow-on on that one is, how much do cryptocurrencies or digital currencies like Bitcoin complicate your job?
There are definite complications as you come up with different, and so you, just as we did with currency, and some of the room played a big part of that, we put in different regulations or reporting requirements that made it harder for those who would do bad things to take advantage of our financial system. As we move towards some of these new currencies, we need to look to take similar steps.
Oh, okay. We have a question here. At some point you were talking about NSD and what we've done after 9/11. And so someone asked, can you elaborate on the interagency process involved in responding to incidents? How is a decision made, whether it's law enforcement, economic, military?
So I think what you're seeing now structurally is a change. So when I, in the prior administration and through this administration in the National Security Council, there was a group that would try to respond to terrorism incidents, the CSG. And what you do is you essentially we sit around a table in the Situation Room, and it'll be representatives from each of the relevant agencies: Treasury, State, Department of Justice, FBI, Department of Defense, CIA. You'd get briefed on what the intelligence showed the threat to be, and then people would present, okay, well, I have the following option available under the legal tools and authorities that are within my purview. And sometimes you pick one of those tools from that discussion. Sometimes you'd have a campaign that used a variety of those tools to just cause the maximum amount of disruption. You're starting to see that same mentality or approach on cyber. And so now there's a CRG that is operating along the same principle. In terrorism, you had a group under the auspices of the Director of National Intelligence, the National Counter-Terrorism Center, that would take together the whole community's view on what the intel showed a terrorist threat and compile it so you had one view. There's a similar model now that's new called the CTIC in cyber. So I think you're starting to see some of the structures put in place that allow for the execution of this whole of government, all tools, disruption deterrent strategy.
I feel a little bad, but in graduate school, some of you know they have something called an oral exam where a gang of professors can ask you any question on any topic. And if you survive that, they give you a degree. So we'll give you some kind of degree when you get through this. It's all, I'm trying to organize them, but they're great questions, but they cover a lot of ground. And so this one is in matters of attribution. How are you protecting basically sources and methods, tradecraft, when it comes to cyber threat detection and disruption? So how do you make that? That's actually a good question. How do you make the decision about what will be released?
And that was part of the creation of National Security Division, and we've become we're quite used to doing that calculation when it comes to bringing cases, criminal cases within the justice system against terrorists. And so that involves seeing if you can use certain legal statutes like that balance the due process of the defendants with the need to protect sources and methods consistent with the Constitution, like CIPA, Classified Information Protection Act. And it also means that there are definitely occasions where, because there was a sensitive source or method used to collect the information, that the loss of that source or method means it's not worth bringing the criminal case. And that's a process of granting what's called use if it's classified information. And we have a system that's set up that really comes from the
TNI.
Terrorism side. Actually, it's under the use is ultimately under the Attorney General, but it involves getting the views of the intelligence community as to what declassification would be under a decision that would be ultimately the DNI's.
Maybe on a related one, when the private sector shares information with the government, to what extent who decides how that information is shared? What are the challenges in information sharing? So when you get information, and this came up a lot in the discussion of the bill, which is if I share with the government, am I then going to be prosecuted or fined? So
this is probably too broad to do because it's some version of it. It depends. But I think what you saw with CISA, the Cyber Information Sharing Act, that when it came to certain technical indicators, that you have an act now that provides immunity for the sharing of these technical indicators. And we're working to build on that as close as we can to real-time threat information. So you see, a certain variant of malware, you could, by automation, have it go from your system into a central repository that could do analysis and then spit back anonymized reports. So it doesn't say which victims, but says we're seeing this following new strain of malware or tactic and technique. Another type of information we're sharing is that contextual information. Why did they take what they took when they took it? That requires talking not to the tech side of the house or passing bits and bytes information, but talking to the business side of the house. And I think there are ways in which you can have those conversations in which you protect the business, try to protect the business interest of the victim. You don't want to re-victimize the victim. And when it comes to economic espionage cases by nation-state actors, we're not going to bring a case if we got the case from the victim coming forward and the victim said, hey, I want to share this information so you can learn about it, but I don't want to be named. If it were a terrorist group or if it's a nation-state doing a destructive attack, I wouldn't say the same pledge. But it's definitely an area where there's a lot of new action by regulatory agencies, from SEC doing its first enforcement action recently to FTC. So I have sympathy for the general counsel crew whose job it is to go tell their board, if you do X, Y will result, because it's just not that certain a world right now. We're still developing, I think, what the legal regulatory regime looks like.
How do you decide to move forward with a prosecution? What is it you look for?
Well, first and foremost, it's a facts and an evidence determination. Are we able to prove up, do we believe, to a jury of the defendant's peers beyond a reasonable doubt using information that we are allowed to use in a criminal trial? And that's got to be our primary determination. And then there's discretion issues. Is this a good use of resources?
Sure. Are white hat, jet lag. Are white hat hackers that notify security breaches or thefts being prosecuted? And maybe the other question should be, should they be?
Yeah. It's a little bit out of my purview over the National Security Division.
Oh, okay.
I'll just say generally that there's different types that are encompassed in that. So there might be some who are doing it for revenge. They put the white hat on themselves, and they have a motivation where they're saying they're doing it well, but what they actually do is clear violation of the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act and causes harm to another victim. And I think you've heard my colleagues on the criminal side of the house that they're going to look at that like they would other criminal cases. There are others that do these kind of proof of concept papers.
Yeah.
One of which, I talked about the Internet of Things. You've already seen a recall, a giant recall of about 1.3 million vehicles off the road, and it was because there was a proof of concept hack that said that in the car system you had an internet connected entertainment system. You also had parts of the core engine design of the vehicle that were internet connected. They weren't supposed to be able to talk to each other. Well, a proof of concept hacker showed you could get in through the entertainment system, hop over and take over the steering of the car. That led to the first recall of kind of over 1 million of these vehicles. That type of research is important in public service. What that guy did not do was hack into some unwitting driver's car and force him off the road. That we would look at as, I would assume the criminal division would look at as criminal activity. Yeah.
I just was on a panel, I was telling John beforehand, with the guy who hacked into an airplane and then tweeted about it. And he's really impressive. He has a shaved head. He's about 6'6". He's Scottish and he's very burly. And he had a long blue beard as long as my tie and was wearing a leather kilt and army boots. So, and it wasn't clear to me. He said they denied him boarding when he went to fly to the conference, the airline. And it wasn't clear if they were still mad about him hacking into the entertainment system or if it was the blue beard and kilt that got them. But I think the hackers do worry about it. Is this one too technical? I mean, I don't. We can put it at the bottom.
Okay.
All right, we'll come back to that one. Technical enough for a legal sense. So here's one. Thanks for a great talk. Can you talk a little bit about Game Over Zeus botnet, how the disrupt process worked in that case and where it is now?
Yeah, and so that's one that was handled through great work by U.S. attorneys' offices and through the Computer Crime Intellectual Property section at the Department of Justice. But I think it was an important case. And what you saw in Game Over Zeus is a combination. This was a giant botnet, and so hundreds and hundreds of thousands of compromised computers. And what the bad guys do with the botnet is once they have the compromised computers, they essentially make it into a network. They have a command and control server, and they can use that botnet. This is what we saw the Iranian affiliated hackers do to do the denial of service attack against the financial industry. They can use the botnet to overwhelm a server with requests for information so that the normal customers no longer can access it. They can't do its regular business. What you can also do with that type of control, though, is inject malware into people's computers. And what you saw with Game Over Zeus is that they would use this cyber weapon of mass destruction, if you will, that they had created, and then inject things like a program called CryptoLocker that would do what I described earlier, encrypt the contents of their computers, and then force them to pay money to get it back. It could also use it to do things like take over people's webcams, spy on them, so-called sextortion, and then get them to pay money so you don't release embarrassing videos. And what you saw there is both criminal action, where you go after the people responsible. You also saw great private sector collaboration across countries where they work together to do the hygiene part, to try to clean the computers off where they could of internet service providers. And you saw a hybrid of criminal civil process to try to get injunctive relief. Because one legal problem that's new, where I do think we need a better solution, would be, are we allowed to seize, let's say you do the botnet, can we seize the command and control server, which we want to do both for evidentiary purposes, but you also want to be able to use it ideally to either figure out a way to notify all the victims so they can clean and patch their computers, or, and this might be more difficult depending on the circumstances, do the hygiene yourself. So use what the bad guy created in order to wipe it off the computer so it's gone and no one can take advantage of again of that botnet.
We're going to let John escape in about 10 minutes or so. When we plotted this out, I didn't realize it would be a long inquisition. So we'll give him a bit of a break. But I would, just as a piece of advice, I don't know how many of you guys do this, but if you have a built-in webcam or something, I usually put a piece of tape over it. Just a little paranoia. You might want to think about it.
Well, while you were traveling, it came out, not just the director of the FBI does similar things. I think it was Zuckerberg. Facebook said he does the same thing. They both put tape over their webcam, so it does seem like a good idea.
You can take the tape off when you want to take a picture of grandma. So,
and maybe the next design of the product, you won't have to use tape because it will come with a camera cover.
You can do amazing things with the stuff located on your phone. It's a little. The first meeting I ever went to with a friendly intelligence agency from a Middle Eastern country, they walked in the room and they took their phones out and they took the batteries out, and I thought, uh-oh. So that's, if you want to have a secure phone, take the battery out. Is there a trend on who the beneficiaries are in ransomware? You mentioned criminal organizations, terrorist groups, and state actors. Is there one that's gaining more access and that we should be more worried about and focused on?
I think we need to worry, unfortunately, at least in my spot, to worry about them all. But if there's a trend that I think you'll see increase, it's going to be this blended threat. So a criminal group, in the way they work, it's quite sophisticated now. So a criminal group might create the botnet, and they're doing it for profit, but then they rent out the tool that they created. So someone wants to, inject their crypto locker using your botnet. You don't give them the botnet. They pay you in order to inject their tool and then run the scheme that they want to run with with the infrastructure that you created. I think as the costs of getting caught increase, you're going to see nation states try to use proxy groups to commit their activity, and part of that might be trying to take advantage of criminal groups. And particularly concerning would be if the terrorists were able to marry up with the capabilities of the most sophisticated criminal groups.
When I look at this, though, one of the things that's been impressive over, say, the last few years is the professionalization of cybercrime. And so you now have very sophisticated groups, some of which are created on the fly, that have specialties. And it's not just one guy in a basement, it's a gang of specialists or a group of specialists. What do you think the best way to disrupt that is? And do you see that as something? The nature of the criminal activity has changed. What are you doing to keep up with it?
You have to do multiple things at once. So one is improving the defensive side of the house, so it raises the costs, makes it more difficult to do. And they're going to go after the low-hanging fruit by and large. It's not like the advanced persistent threat who may continue to target a company or a government agency till they get in. Secondly, it's got to be a multinational solution. We need international partnership and cooperation because they're located all over the world. That means both government to government, but it also means encouraging these groups that are forming that allow for information sharing and concerted action without the government, purely within the private sector. And you're seeing a big growth in that model. And that'll take a will that, and there needs to be a consequence. If you're the state actor who wants to stay outside of civilized countries, harbor known criminal groups, that there are consequences to you as a state. And I think you're seeing more and more countries put statutes on the book that allow them to prosecute these types of crimes, take disruptive action, and you're seeing more and more companies create structures where they can share information even across borders.
One thing I didn't expect when I was looking at this was there is a correlation, I guess it's a negative correlation, between weak cyber laws and cyber criminal activity in your country. And the classic example of that would be Brazil. So I didn't expect that. I thought that, law enforcement, who cares? And it turns out it does have an effect. So that's interesting. That wasn't a plug for the Budapest Convention, although it may have sounded like it. The Bowen Dam case raises, we've only got 5 or 6 questions left, so you're almost off the hook. Bowen Dam case raises a question about the proliferation of black market cyber tools and what can be done to combat this. And I'll just mention, to give John a little bit of a break, I just a week ago spent 2 days in a room in Geneva talking about this, where it turns out to be really hard because traditional non-proliferation tools don't work as well as we might hope. It's difficult to define what it is you want to catch, and the availability of someone, I think it was Symantec, gave a number that showed like 4 million new pieces of malware being created every year currently. So a hard one to deal with. When you think about, though, the cybercrime black market and bleeding into this blended threat or providing tools to groups like North Korea, Iran, or cyber criminals, what's your reaction?
No, I think it's a good audience for a great area for future study to try to figure out what a regime looks like. And you've seen Commerce Department and state look to see what steps they can take in this space. But there are some similarities, but there are also important differences to the counter-proliferation regimes we've applied against more traditional threats, being nuclear, chem, bio, hard weapons when it comes to code.
One thing I've always assumed, and it looks to be, I hope it's true since I assumed it, is that to the extent that Russian language groups are one of the primary sources of advanced criminal malware, they seem to be relatively disciplined in who they give it to. Is that a fair statement? I mean, when you look at the groups you go after, like the blended attacks or the person in Malaysia, where are they getting their tools from?
Well, I'll say this. You've had Al-Qaeda dating back to 2012. You had Zawahiri, the head of Al-Qaeda, call upon jihadists across the world to use cyber tools to cause, in particular, financial disruption along with other attacks. You've seen Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, Islamic State in the Levant, echo the call and actively seek to acquire the capability. And because we know they would use it if they had it, that means to date they haven't been able to acquire the capability to match their intentions. I think certain nation states and very sophisticated criminal groups have that capability, so at least to date it hasn't ended up in the hands of those terrorists.
If you were going to look at a terrorist group, which one do you think, this is not really a fair question, who do you think is likely to develop the tools first? I always pick Hezbollah, if that makes it easier for you.
I'll leave that one, I think, to others to.
Okay. I knew he was going to dodge that one. I'd still bet on Hezbollah. What additional authorities does NSD need to disrupt illicit activity on the dark web?
On the dark?
Yeah, and what can government do to disrupt the dark web?
I think it's something we continue to take a look at. I don't have a specific statutory request that's designed for the dark web. I think you're seeing the market play a role as well, though. For instance, in theory, there are some who philosophically, like the idea of the so-called dark web, that is spaces on the internet that are not indexed the way a Google or others will index almost every site. And most people who are doing legitimate business or commerce actively want to be indexed. There might be a reason, legitimate reason to use the dark web. That said, the vast amount of activity that's coming from there is criminal. And what you're seeing now in terms of the market is because there's so much bad activity coming from the dark web or these anonymized sources, you're seeing some of the security services not allow that traffic to hit their networks because it's just too great a risk for their customers, even though in theory, philosophically, they like the idea of an anonymized space. That might help cabin it a little bit. If you knew, it would still be a problem in terms of used for information sharing, but if you knew that everything that came from there was criminal, it would allow you to take better defensive measures.
That's an interesting thought because that might be a different kind of solution. We're starting a research project here on dark web activities, and I'm always worried the FBI is going to show up when we look at some of these sites. Almost done. So here's a question about OPM, which I know is dear to your heart. And it says, you talked about blended activities with ISIS and other groups. Was OPM a blended activity, meaning were they going to use the information for other purposes than what we think they did? And then the last part is, how would you do damage control on OPM?
Well, I'm one of the OPM victims that received my notice.
That's how many in the room were OPM victims? Hold up your hand. Oh, that's great. Well, it's great in a relative sense, but just get used to it.
I'll tell you one thing that was it's hard to find the silver lining in the OPM hack. But one thing that I've talked about with victim companies, it was a chance for those in government to sit around the table and have some of the same conversations and lessons learned that we've been preaching to private companies. Turns out it's really hard when you've, so that includes, we've proposed model legislation for a federal data breach statute. And it is, right now there are about 46 different state data breach notification statutes. So if you're a company and you're a multinational, a multi-state company, let alone multinational, it's great for lawyers, as a full employment act for lawyers, that you have to wrestle through 46, but it doesn't make any sense as a country. So I hope we're able, through Congress, to federalize data breach so we have one standard, and there was a proposal from the administration for it. But there are some hard decision points in that standard. So you've been breached, but how do you know what information has been compromised? What standard of certainty do you need internally that would trigger your obligation to tell customers? And that's important both for your business, but also as those of us who are the recipients of such a notice. I don't want to be over-informed because what am I supposed to do with I want to know exactly what they did with the information that they took. And you often don't know that as the company, so it walks through. It turns out, I think we learned some lessons on OPM to make sure that within government we have a similar sort of process in place for the next one, so that you know what the threshold is and you have a reasoned way of making the decision on who to inform about what.
Do you think so OPM in some ways helped lead to the summit agreement. Do you think with OPM you'd say case closed, or what's
Well, I'll never say. The only way we'll say case closed is when we figure out who did, at the Justice Department, figured out who did it, caught them, convicted them. So, not case closed from this perspective.
Closed. Okay. Same true with Snowden, I expect. So that's the only time we're going to say that word. See, are there additional things the U.S. can do to deter cyber-espionage? And this question focused particularly on Chinese cyber-espionage. What more would you do to change their behavior? Do you think the process, we have these high-level meetings now, we have the agreement. The agreement, I think, is serious because you wouldn't, agreeing with something to the U.S. and then not really doing it, that would be sort of, that's okay in the diplomatic world. But you wouldn't agree with the G20 if you weren't, because that really hangs yourself out to dry. If you take the 20 biggest economies and promise you're not going to do something. But got the deal out of the summit. That was good. Indictments played a critical role in that, knowing from discussions with the Chinese how they were worried about further indictments or sanctions. What more would you want to do, though, to change their behavior?
Well, and you're one of the world's leading experts on this issue on changing Chinese behavior. I'd just say from our point of view, again, looking at it not just as a China issue, but as what world do we want to live in when it comes to protecting our digital space, which is there's going to be activity that emanates from China and other countries. There are crooks, putting aside nation-state actors, that come from the United States along with other countries. We need to continue to get better, I think, at doing the investigation, attribution, figuring out who did it, when we can, imposing consequences on those who benefit from their criminal activity, from their theft, and make it so that those actions are a routine cost. And as I said earlier, that every time you're thinking about doing this, you're looking over your shoulder and wondering, okay, this was fun to do today, but I may want to travel in a year. I can never travel again for the rest of my life because I've been caught and named. Or my country is doing a crackdown now, and even though I thought I was doing this on behalf of one service, I may get locked up a month from now, so I'd rather go into a different line of business. There's more to be done, I think, on that front.
Yeah, how do you feel about attribution? Do you feel like we're getting better at it? Are you getting better at it?
Yes, I think I think we've unleashed now some of the best in the world in terms of investigators and prosecutors, and given them this mission. And I think every day they're getting a little better at it.
I will say that that I was in Beijing about 10 days ago, and talking with some Chinese government colleagues mentioned that the U.S. was developing strategies to change their behavior. And the look on their face was like I had tased them. So it didn't go over though. I thought, I've made a faux pas here. But I do think that you can change their behavior. I think that ultimately the Chinese want to be members of the global community. They'd like a more important role. How do you feel about some of the other folks we look at when you think about Iran, who might be coming on, or when you think about North Korea, who might not be coming on? What do you think about changing their behavior?
Because you just saw us in terms of bringing the case with Iran. I think regardless of the country, we need to have this similarity of approach. It's also true with every action they take. Say North Korea. North Korea is going to be a difficult actor, as they have been across the sphere. It's not going to be unique in cyber. But it was really important in responding to Sony, not just to send a message to North Korea, but it sends a message to all the other countries and some of the non-state actors who are figuring out what this new world looks like. What can I get away with in cyberspace? Is it always going to be anonymous, so I have a free pass to do things here that I would never get away with in the brick and mortar world? Or even if I'm caught, where's that red line? What's going to prompt action? And we need, as best we can, to be clear where those red lines are. And one thing you always worry about as you're developing a new deterrence strategy is you don't want to encourage them to make a mistake, and then you're up in an escalated space because they didn't realize they had crossed that red line. Because we're in this new world, it's particularly important to do that now. And the first step that we've made significant progress on, but need to continue in that vein, is obvious, but it's one that I think didn't get talked about a lot, which is the first step is figuring out who did it, right? And then the second would be making sure that the adversary or bad guys know you can figure out who did it. If we're going to then have any model of deterrence, it's going to have to build off that foundation.
Do you have country-specific policies? Did you target specific groups or countries?
Well, I won't, going over to the National Security Council, I think people think in terms of countries, regions, et cetera. And when we're doing a particular case, though, it's going to be built from the ground up based on what the facts and evidence are in that particular set of circumstances.
Well, I don't know. I think we've given them a really hard time. I think you hit all my questions. That's amazing. Any final questions from the audience, because we are drawing close to our time here? No? You're tired too? Good. John, any final words you'd want to say about 10-year anniversaries, future of cybercrime, relations with the intelligence community? We've managed to largely dodge the T word, which was one of the goals here, terrorism. But this is your chance.
Well, preventing terrorism will still be the top priority for my division. No, I just want to thank you for hosting us today, but also with so many scholars, experts in the audience today. This is an exciting area where our law, our policy is not kept up to a very fast-moving change in technology and threat. And so your work in terms of helping come up with new ideas, be they new tools that we can do to disrupt or new ways that might encourage companies to improve defensive practices or share information are vital. And it's one where every day we're asking ourselves, what more can we do? And we're at a very, unlike other fields, we don't have a static approach in place. So I look very much forward to continuing this dialogue to you and getting your thoughts and views. Thank you for having me.
Great.
That was cool.
We clearly misplanned because I think we thought you were going to